peaceful city at the centre of what's been described as the most tense and dangerous security situation in the world today. At a meeting on Sunday, the United Nations High Commissioner told its members that sanctions implemented on North Korea earlier this year may not be having the desired effect. And instead of punishing leader Kim Jong-un for firing test missiles over Japan and towards the US, they're punishing the people.
The humanitarian assistance provided by UN agencies and others is literally a lifeline for some 13 million acutely vulnerable individuals. I ask that members of this council conduct an assessment of the human rights impact of sanctions, and that conduct or that action be taken to minimize their adverse humanitarian consequences.
Both the US and Japan agree that North Koreans are suffering.
The Security Council reiterates its deep concern at the grave hardship that people in the DPRK are subject to.
But neither Washington nor Tokyo seem willing to ease their stance.
The systematic human rights violations and abuses of the North Korean government are more than the cause of its people's suffering. They are a means to a single end: keeping the Kim Jong-un regime in power.
Among the reasons the UN is so worried is because of Pyongyang's blatant ramping up of its arsenal. On Tuesday, North Korea's state broadcaster showed Kim Jong-un attending a conference on munitions, as well as congratulating those who worked on the latest intercontinental ballistic missile. The US and Asian officials now believe Pyongyang has the means to produce weapons capable of a biological attack, and that ongoing investment in armour has been taking food out of the mouths of North Koreans for years now. A famine in the 1990s is estimated to have killed 2.5 million people, while the World Food Programme says 70% of the current population do not know where their next meal will come from. Meanwhile, China seems to be preparing for thousands of refugees who may stream across its border in the coming weeks. In a leaked document seen by the New York Times, Beijing is preparing camps in 3 villages to help those fleeing. When asked on Monday, China's Foreign Ministry spokesman Liu Kan said he hadn't seen any such document, but also didn't deny it existed. So while the evidence seems to be mounting that North Korea is building up its weaponry, it's harder to tell what the closed state or its leader have in mind. Vanessa Keneally, The Newsmakers.
Okay, let's go to our panel in Washington, D.C. We're joined by Ambassador Joseph Detrani, a former U.S. envoy for the Six Nation talks with North Korea, and retired Professor Han Park, who's acted as an unofficial negotiator between the two countries, as well as Robert Manning, who was a policy advisor for the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Robert Manning, let me begin with you. Are sanctions counterproductive if the UN is saying that it might actually lead to people starving to death?
That's a complicated issue. It's not so simple. The main cause of starvation for the North Korean people is the North Korean regime. And I note that Kim Jong-un doesn't look like he's missed very many meals. If they have enough money to test dozens of missiles and develop nuclear weapons, they could certainly purchase the food to feed their people. They choose not to, number one. Number two, most of the UN programs do not allow, that North Koreans do not allow them to monitor the actual distribution of the food. In the past, we know that the North Korean military has taken some of this food and stockpiled it. So if you're going to provide humanitarian aid, you need to be able to have complete transparency so you know where it ends up. Mm-hmm. And we don't have that. But secondly, it's the elite in North Korea that really get hit by the sanctions. So that's their intention, and I believe that's the result.
Okay, so Professor Han Park, is it just the elite that are getting hit by the sanctions and that actually this is not going to lead to people starving to death?
Yeah, it will lead starvation of the people, vast number of people. 3 things are very clear we have to realize. One, North Korea is already a nuclear state. So denuclearization is not a realistic goal anymore, maybe non-proliferation. 2, North Korean leadership will never collapse. The leadership is very solid. People may starve. Economic difficulties will never cause collapse of a system. Legitimacy crisis will cause collapse of system, and that regime, Kim Jong-un regime, is enjoying legitimacy from the support of the people immensely. And another thing very clear is there's no military option.
Right.
I don't think we can use military successfully, effectively.
Okay, so before we talk about nukes, I just want to ask Joseph Detrani, Mr. Ambassador, there's something interesting about what the ICC judge, Thomas Bergenthal, said recently. He said the North Korean camps are worse than the Nazi camps, essentially worse than Auschwitz. And we've had the International Bar Association War Crimes Committee come out with this report, and it shows it's horrendous, right? Kwan Liso, they show horrendous torture, people are starved to death, they're being fed to the dogs and so on. So if you have the international community looking at this, and it can be fairly solidly ascertained that this is going on in death camps in North Korea, people will be asking, well, how do you actually stop this if not through sanctions, or maybe if not through war? Nukes aside, if they're starving people to death in gulags, how do you actually stop this?
Well, let me just say two things on this. First of all, the question on sanctions. Sanctions are biting, and sanctions are focusing on their nuclear and their missile programs and their other programs, and that's where the sanctions are. A lot of issues touch sanctions in other ways because, let's face it, China's not importing the coal, not doing the trade in the past. Kaesung, an industrial complex, has been closed, so fewer people are employed. But that's an issue for North Korea. As Mr. Manning said, the public distribution system is broken. And sanctions are affecting the leadership, and they're focused on the leadership. And I can tell you the NGOs that are doing humanitarian work, they get permission to go in there to do it. But let me mention on the gulags, when you mention that, that has always been a very key part of our discussions with North Korea. If we go back to 2005, September 2005, we had a joint statement. And in that joint statement was focusing on the nuclear programs. But it was lending itself then to ultimately a dialogue with the United States and North Korea, with other countries like Japan, South Korea, to normalize relations. And we always put human rights on the top of the list, where there would have to be transparency into the programs, and there'd have to be progress and benchmarks for measuring it. So this has always been a very important issue for the United States. And I think as we normalize, as we move towards a more normal relationship with North Korea, a non-nuclear weapons North Korea, we could address that issue very, very clearly.
Yeah, it's interesting that we've had Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of State, saying we're ready to talk anytime, no preconditions. It's more diplomatic than the fire and fury and little rocket man words that came from the president. That's interesting. We'll have to wait and see where that takes us. Let me ask you, Robert Manning, the fundamental question about North Korea and nukes. There's a perception that North Korea is hell-bent on collective suicide, or it is at the very least prepared for collective suicide by launching a first strike on whether it's South Korea, whether it's Japan or the United States. Is that true? Or is North Korea maybe a more rational actor who just wants nukes for deterrent purposes?
Well, we don't know all of their intentions, but what you suggested, I believe the exact opposite is the truth, that every indication we've had for many, many years is that the Kim family dynasty highest priority is regime survival. And so I think they see nukes certainly as a deterrent from an American attack. And I think American officials ought to be thinking about that when they make these comments, which I think plays into their threat narrative. But the worry in the U.S. is that they have something in mind beyond deterrence, that if they get an ICBM, they perhaps would use it for coercive purposes to try to threaten a limited nuclear war to get the U.S. off the Korean Peninsula, or even threaten coercion to try to force unification on their terms with South Korea. That's the big fear.
Okay, Han Park, is North Korea a rational or irrational actor that will risk collective suicide for the sake of Juche?
No, North Korea is extremely rational people. They know what's good for them subjectively. They want to survive, not the political system as a whole, but the regime and the leadership itself. And there's no danger for the collapse of the regime anytime soon. The last 10, 12 years, we waited under the banner of strategic patience. Never worked. Strategic patience was designed to wait for the collapse of the system, and pressure, economic, political pressures has not produced any outcome. So I don't think we can expect North Korea's system to collapse or abandon nuclear ambition through this kind of punitive measures. So we've got to have more positive involvement with North Korea, engaging North Korea in such as non-proliferation global, that is non-proliferation. So once, North Korea is deeply confused. Face saving is so important. Name calling, like President Trump did a few weeks ago, is very counterproductive.
Right.
So we have to respect North Korea's subjective sense of dignity, involve them with what we are doing here, what is doable. Denuclearization of North Korea, we have to keep it up. It doesn't work anymore. North Korea is a nucleus. It has scientists, science, no material, everything. It has a market even. So
Okay.
there's no way.
So
that
let
we
me ask Joseph
back to-
Detrani. Okay, good point. Let me ask Joseph Detrani. Should that be given up, denuclearization of North Korea? Just let them keep their nukes because they have them anyway.
Absolutely not. Accepting North Korea as a nuclear weapon state would be a grave disaster. It would be a terrible mistake. We're looking at the potential for a nuclear proliferation in the region. North Korea with nuclear weapons, certainly South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, possibly other countries will seek their own nuclear weapons capabilities. In addition to the nuclear arms race that we would see, we have a question of proliferation. Some of these weapons, fissile material, possibly could be getting into the hands of bad actors. And this we have to prevent. And also, having these nuclear weapons, the chance of miscalculation or misunderstanding that precipitates something that eventually will use nuclear weapons, it would be a very grave disaster for the region and for the world. So accepting North Korea as a nuclear weapon state would be a terrible mistake. And that's why the goal is comprehensive, verifiable, irreversible denuclearization. But considering North Korea has security concerns, addressing those security concerns, going back to what we did in 2005 with the joint statement, where we were talking about a more normal relationship with North Korea, but a denuclearized North Korea. And we've done that not only in 2005, we did it in 1994, with the agreed framework and the Perry process, Secretary Perry in 1999. So we've had periods where North Korea was moving towards accepting the fact that they would not be a nuclear weapon state. They have nuclear weapons now. We know, we assess they have nuclear weapons, but the fact is we will not accept them as a nuclear weapon state.
Okay, so Han Park, don't you accept the premise that some nations might be a little bit more responsible with their nukes than Kim Jong-un and his family? That perhaps France or the UK or the United States are a little bit more responsible with their nuclear weapons than having it in Kim Jong-un's hands?
We should have a global perception, more accommodating. We cannot divide the world, the good guys, bad guys. We can't do that. If we're going to unable to live with the bad guys, we cannot live together at all. So it is so important. We have to give up the goal of denuclearization North Korea because we failed. Last 20 years we tried, we failed because we never wanted to denuclearize. Actually, we wanted to push the system to collapse. It never did. It will not collapse. Denuclearization, we missed the boat.
Okay.
We have to accept North Korea as a nuclear state, make a better state.
Okay, so let's get Robert Manning in. You want to jump in?
Well, I don't agree with that. As our great American philosopher Yogi Berra said, it ain't over till it's over. And I think we've never tried the kind of comprehensive economic sanctions that are underway now. China has never cooperated to the degree it is. And I think that's the reason I watched Secretary Tillerson make an extraordinary effort yesterday in not only talking about his willingness to meet Kim Jong-un or anybody else with no preconditions, but also made the point that he understands North Korea has a big investment in these nuclear weapons, and he didn't expect them to give them up immediately. So he was looking at a process. And I hope the North Koreans were listening. And I think the other thing he said that was quite important was how the degree to which we're cooperating with China, including talking about possible contingencies in an instability scenario. This has never happened before. So I think it's quite important. The pressure's building, and we're in an uncharted territory in terms of pressure on North Korea. So let's see where this goes. And I think it's quite possible we may see talks in the near future.
Okay, so Joseph Detrani, is the answer to the riddle in the camps that the Chinese are allegedly building along the border, but there seems to be a lot of evidence that they do have those camps. Because before, and as somebody at the table, you would know, the Chinese answer was, hey, we can't be as hawkish as you want to be on North Korea. We have to live in this region. We have to deal with the flood of refugees that might cross the border if the regime collapses. And we're here, you're there across the Pacific. The fact that China might be building camps along the border to possibly accommodate refugees and so on, does that suggest that the Chinese have turned a little bit towards Washington on this issue?
No, look, China has been very aggressive in pursuing some of the UN Security Council resolutions that have sanctioned North Korea on the coal and trade generally. Obviously, the crude oil is still going into North Korea. So China has been on the same page with the international community as it relates to North Korea and sanctions on North Korea. I mean, we're talking about 23 ballistic missile launches this year alone. We're talking about a nuclear test in September of what North Korea says was a hydrogen bomb. And we assess over 150 kiloton event and so forth. So there's been a significant amount of proliferation. So I think what China, I don't know that they're building these camps. Some of those reports are out there. But indeed, if they're preparing, because there's always that potential for instability from within. I disagree with my colleague on this. Regime change has not been the U.S. policy towards North Korea. And I don't think anyone is on that page. And I think President Trump, as soon as he came into office, said he would be willing to sit down with Kim Jong-un and talk about these issues. And as Mr. Manning said yesterday, our Secretary of State said, unconditional talks with North Korea are available. Come to the table and put everything on the table. We will talk about denuclearization. That is our goal down the road. North Korea can make their case for why they want to retain it and the security assurances they need. That needs to be negotiated. But if China is building camps like that, I wouldn't be overly surprised, but I don't know that they're doing that. Right. Because there's always the unknown aspect of what's going on in North Korea, because let's face it, internal dynamics in North Korea are very opaque to the outside world. We don't know the tension that Kim Jong-un is undergoing with his own elites. Mind you, this is a man who who executed his uncle in a very horrific way. Yes. And what he did with his brother, Kim Jong-nam. So there's a dynamic in North Korea we're not aware of. Yes. China may be better aware, but China may be making preparations.
Yeah, and interesting to know that he might possibly have executed his uncle because he felt his uncle was getting too much of the pie when it came to business with China. Han Park, I want to give you the final word. I have to move on. Give me the final word. Tell me how the international community can get out of this mess with North Korea.
Together. We cannot rely on China. We should not trust China too much in this regard. China has its own national goals, keeping North Korea as a socialist ally next door with a strong military and economic and political climate. That is what Xi Jinping's China wants. We cannot expect China to play the game of the United Nations or certainly not the United States. If that's the case, then North Korea will not collapse. China will provide food aid, any emergent kind of needs in North Korea. So the world is much more complicated. We have to, and I think denuclearization of North Korea is, we missed the boat.
Understood.
We waited too long.
Understood.
So,
Understood.
yes.
Okay, I'll let that be the final word. I've got to move on. But gentlemen, I learned a lot from all of you. I thank you very much for joining us. Joseph Detrani, Han Park,
Okay.
and Robert Manning. Thanks
Thank
for
you.
joining us on the Newsmakers.